All right, good morning. So when I heard that the Most Reverend Nicholas Oko, the primate and Archbishop of all Nigeria, was coming to visit us here at St. George's, I was in the midst at that point of preparing. This was last March maybe? I was preparing for our annual Anglican chaplain gathering, which was in Mount Pleasant, South Carolina this year, in late April. And one of the presentations I prepared was on the Anglican Communion. And it was as a prelude to then Bishop Martin Minns getting up and sort of talking about the current state of things. So on one of Father Don and I's fly fishing excursions, there's a lot of time to chat to and from because it's about an hour and a half. And so Doug knows about that. So we got talking about this and thought it would be good to have some preparatory kinds of things to the Archbishop coming to visit us. So his might more naturally follow after this one. However, the way we're thinking of this is he gave, I hope you all heard his lecture last week. It was, if I turn this off a minute while I say something nice about Don. He's always saying it's brilliant. Well, you ought to go back and listen to it again. On one of my morning hikes this week, I listened to it again, and it's incredible. I'm going to listen again this week. It's really good stuff, and then I'm going to read the book, the condensed version. So I encourage you to do that. This will be a little bit more historical to give you some information about the Anglican Communion, and then Archbishop Oko will be the one that brings sort of the current state of things. And I'm hoping this will help provide you with a good context for that. So, diving right in, slide number 2. I heard there was a YouTube presentation out there on how not to give a PowerPoint briefing, and I didn't have time to watch it, so I'll probably make all the mistakes. I'll try not to look at my slides and talk to the screen. I know those but this is a keynote, so I don't have to worry about it. It's not a PowerPoint. So a brief historical summary to start with. Although Christianity is evidenced to have come to Britain as early as the late 2nd century, and you all knew that already, the church first officially came to Britain via the arrival of Augustine of Canterbury in 597, eventually becoming established as the Church of England. We just fast-forwarded a whole lot of years. Separating from the Bishop of Rome during the 16th century reign of King Henry VIII, reuniting briefly and for what was for the English reformers painfully under Queen Mary I, and then separating again under the monarchy of Queen Elizabeth I. Unlike the Puritan Congregationalism that grew out of the Continental Reformation, the Church of England thought of itself then, and together with most of the member churches of the Anglican Communion today, continues to think of itself not as a departure from the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, but rather as a reformed continuation of the ancient Catholic Church, eventually becoming known as the Anglican Ecclesiana, the Church of England, right? Anglican Church. Yet what eventually would grow and expand into a worldwide communion of Anglican churches grew out of what began as a distinctly national church, the Church of England. Hence the historically rooted precedence of Canterbury and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Anglican worship, you may not know, outside of England took root as early as 1578 in, anybody want to guess? Canada, actually. Canada. The Anglican Communion then traces much of the laying of its international foundations to the work of God the Holy Spirit through the missionary ministries of the Church of England, which included, and you will have maybe heard of one or two of these, The SPCK was the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, founded in 1698. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, or SPG, founded in 1701, and that's now known as US. I don't know the history of that change. And the Church Missionary Society, or CMS, which is maybe one of the most well-known, and it was founded in 1799. All of these Christian missionary fellowships, mobilized to deploy missionaries abroad, oftentimes to lands colonized as a result of the spread of the British Empire. That makes sense, yes? So the missionary agencies followed as part of the colonization. Dioceses and national churches were subsequently established in these places throughout the 17 and 1800s. They were led initially by bishops deployed from the British Isles. Over the years, Anglican national churches gradually gained their independence from the Church of England. Here in America in 1783, following the Revolutionary War, quote, the parishes of Connecticut elected Samuel Seabury as their bishop. As the Church of England would not ordain him, he turned to the Scottish Episcopal Church, a move seen by some as the beginnings of an Anglican communion with autonomous member churches or provinces. Okay, you all following this? So that's kind of where the autonomy began. Next slide. With this expansion and subsequent growth of Anglicanism outside of Great Britain and Ireland, the communion sought to establish ways of maintaining the unity of the faith throughout its member jurisdictions. Bishops of these Anglican jurisdictions on foreign soil eventually became known as metropolitans, and in 1867, 2 years after the conclusion of our own Civil War, 76 of these were invited by the then Archbishop of Canterbury, Charles Longley, to gather at his Lambeth Palace residence for the first Lambeth Conference. Okay? You might be interested to know, just as an aside, that was the year the first ship passed through the Suez Canal. It was the year Congress approved the building of the Lincoln Memorial. It was the year that Das Kapital was published. It was the year the U.S. bought Alaska from Russia for 2 cents an acre. And most interesting, it was 7 years before the construction of these walls right here. To put it in a little context. Next. The Lambeth Conference of Bishops of the Anglican Communion has met roughly every 10 years since. So it's a once-a-decade sort of meeting. It's at the invitation of His Grace, the Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, quote, to discuss matters of practical interest and to pronounce what the bishops deem expedient in resolutions which may serve as guidelines to future action. So through time and circumstance, we see the Christian faith and practices of the Church of England spreading and then mobilizing and ordering themselves under the organizational leadership of the Archbishop of Canterbury, who establishes a once-a-decade meeting called the Lambeth Conference, gathering by invitation all the bishops of the various Anglican jurisdictions around the world for the stated purpose of nurturing relationships and fostering Christian counsel together for the ongoing common mind, Christian identity, Christian witness of the churches of the communion. That's the stated purpose. Keeping our eye on at least what's my target of talking about what is the Anglican communion, let me quote from the Historical Dictionary of Anglicanism, and I know Sarah's going to want to run out and buy one. So it's by Colin Buchanan. Here's what he wrote. The 1930 Lambeth Conference described the Anglican Communion as a fellowship within the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, of those duly constituted dioceses, provinces, or regional churches in communion with the See of Canterbury. Next. By its earliest definition, then, and this is still historical summary, the Anglican Communion is constituted by the Church of England, together with all Anglican churches worldwide that are in full communion with Canterbury. We'll soon see or hear how, because of events in our lifetime, that definition may well be sort of shifting beneath our feet. Next. The current individual member census of the Anglican Communion is estimated at around 85 million members, making it the third largest Christian church in the world. The second largest is the Orthodox Church, with an estimated 225 to 300 million, so the error in their census is the size of our communion. And the largest is the Roman Catholic Church at well over 1 billion members. Next. Those 85 million Anglican Christians belong to 44 member churches, with church here defined as a geographical province or extra-provincial jurisdiction. Of those 44 member churches, 38 are Anglican provinces and 6 are extra-provincial jurisdictions. And if you'll just go through the next 4 slides, I think just pause on each one and give everybody a chance to look at. This is the list of provinces, and the extra-jurisdictional or the extra-provincial jurisdictions are at the end. Okay, next. Now, those who gathered at the Westminster Church House for the Lambeth Conference in 1968, so we're up to 1968 now, presided over by Archbishop Michael Ramsey, discerned the need for a more frequent and more representative contact among the churches than was possible with a once-a-decade meeting. The constitution of an Anglican Consultative Council, or ACC, was subsequently accepted by the General Synods or conventions of all the member churches of the Communion. And the Council, which meets every 2 to 3 years in different parts of the world, came into being in October of 1969. According to its constitution, the role of the Anglican Consultative Council is to facilitate the cooperative work of the churches of the Communion, to exchange information between provinces and churches, and to help coordinate common action. It advises on the organization and structures of the Communion and seeks to develop common policies with respect to the world mission of the Church, including ecumenical manners. The membership of the ACC includes the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the ex officio president of the Council, and a certain number of bishops, clergy, and lay representatives from each of the Anglican provinces, with numerical representation determined by the size of their donation. No, by the size of the province. I'm not talking about influence now. Just representation. The permanent secretariat of the ACC, known as the Anglican Communion Office, is based in St. Andrew's House, London. The Anglican Communion Office is responsible for organizing and presumably setting the agendas for both the ACC meetings and the Lambeth Conference meetings. Okay? Let's see. The third element of what are known as the Anglican Instruments of Communion is the primates meeting. First, what is an Anglican primate? Somebody asked. Primate of the Anglican Communion, by definition, is the most senior or principal bishop or archbishop of an Anglican province. Some are also referred to as metropolitans. The primates meeting was established in 1978 by Archbishop Michael Coggan, the 101st Archbishop of Canterbury, as an opportunity for, quote, leisurely thought. That sounds Anglican. Leisurely thought, prayer, and consultation, and has met regularly, that is, every 2 to 3 years since its first meeting in 1979. So this is pretty recent, these primates meetings. The Archbishop of Canterbury, to no surprise, chairs the meetings. The Secretary General of the ACC serves as the Secretary. Last but obviously not least is the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is historically to be the focus of unity for what have become known as the other three instruments of communion. So the Lambeth Conference, which he calls, the Anglican Consultative Council, over which he presides as president, the Primates meeting, which he chairs. And if you'd like to read more, you can jump on the AnglicanCommunion.org website, or you could also go read a report that was written in 1999 that talks in detail about all this, called the Virginia Report. Very quick question. Yeah. I think a couple legs are broken. Next. Too much weight. As has already been mentioned, the first Archbishop of the church in Angleland was Bishop Augustine of Canterbury, deployed there from Rome in 597. And Bishop Augustine established Canterbury as Britain's cathedral. And actually, the present cathedral is built upon ruins of multiple previous buildings. This isn't the original. But the original was first constructed around the time that he got there. It began. You all know that Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, who was not the first, but the 69th Archbishop of Canterbury, 1533, and the father of the English Reformation, served during the time of England's 16th century break with Rome and the establishment of the Church of England. The 105th and present-day Archbishop of Canterbury, the Most Reverend and Right Honorable Justin Welby, was enthroned on March 21st of 2013. His immediate predecessor was the Right Reverend Lord Rowan Williams, as most of you know. The Archbishops of Canterbury have historically been looked to by the Anglican Communion of Churches to be their spiritual leader as primus inter pares, or first among equals of the other primates. He's also the primate of all England and diocesan of the Diocese of Canterbury. His seat is in Canterbury Cathedral, where there's also St. Augustine's chair, marking the historic significance of Canterbury for Anglicans. Well, this next section is entitled, All is Not Well. Most of you are quite aware that all has not been well within the Anglican Communion for quite some time. At the Lambeth Conference of 1998, the majority of bishops of the Anglican Communion passed what's known as Lambeth Resolution 1.10, affirming the historic authoritative teaching of the Bible with regard to human sexuality. And yet several provinces of the Communion, to include the Anglican province of the Episcopal Church, have continued to teach and act in ways that do not accord with this teaching of Holy Scripture, as that teaching has been passed on and received from generation to generation and affirmed by this Lambeth Conference. The consecration to the episcopate then in the Episcopal Church of a gay man in 2003, as a statement to the rest of the communion, really, was the defiant event that sort of tipped the balance of patience of the Orthodox Christian leaders of the communion and those who recognize and respect the authority of the Holy Scriptures and the primacy of the mission with which we've been entrusted to proclaim the saving message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, His kingship, His everlasting kingdom to the ends of the earth. I mean, when you think about it, he is supposed to be looked to as the head of the Anglican communion, if you will. And the result has been and continues to be what's been described as a tear in the fabric of our communion. Since 2003, there have been no less than one Lambeth conference, that was in 2008, 4 ACC meetings, and 5 primate meetings. The most recent of these being the ACC meeting that was held in Lusaka, Zambia, in this past April. All of these meetings have fallen short, as hard as they've tried, to find a satisfactory and enduring way forward together through these historical structures of the communion, through these previously described structures. So here we get to it. So in June of 2008, 1 month prior to the Lambeth Conference that year, 1,148 lay and clergy delegates, including 291 Anglican bishops from 29 different countries, emerged out of the midst of all this discord in the communion and gathered in Jerusalem for the first Global Anglican Future Conference. Or you've heard the acronym GAFCON. It's a terrible acronym. It should have come up with GAFCON. You go there to commit gaffe. Hopefully not, especially not theological. So, Global Anglican Future Conference. Paraphrasing from their website, the statement released by the first GAFCON bore testimony that this is a movement that arose because a false gospel was being promoted within the Anglican Communion, which denies the uniqueness of Jesus Christ. He is the only way, the truth, and the life. That's what we mean by his uniqueness. And promotes a variety of sexual preferences and immoral behavior as a universal human right. The statement further announced that GAFCON would be continuing a movement in the Spirit rather than a once-off event. So they sort of served notice, this is not a one-time thing. Continuing to quote, the GAFCON movement describes itself as a global family of authentic Anglicans standing together to retain and restore the Bible to the heart of the Anglican communion with a mission to guard the unchanging, transforming gospel of Jesus Christ and to proclaim him to all the world. And founded on the Bible, bound together by the Jerusalem Statement and Declaration of 2008, and led by a primates council, which represents the majority, that is, more than 70% of the world's Anglicans. GAFCON works to guard and proclaim the unchanging, transforming gospel through biblically faithful preaching and teaching, which frees our churches to make disciples by clear and certain witness to Jesus Christ in all the world. Although this first conference didn't decide to create a formal schism in the Anglican Communion, it expressed plans to set up new ecclesiastical structures, okay, particularly within the liberal provinces of North America. Of particular note, the GAFCON statement makes the distinctive and potentially game-changing claim that recognition by the Archbishop of Canterbury is not necessary to Anglican identity. It also called for the formation of a new council of unelected GAFCON primates. The then Archbishop of the Anglican province of Kenya, the Most Reverend Eliud Wabukala, subsequently served as first chairman of the GAFCON Primates Council. Next. I think I missed one. Yeah, go back one. So here's the first gathering of GAFCON, the conference 2008 in Jerusalem. Okay. And then the next is Archbishop Wabukala. Okay. The GAFCON primates published what's known as the Jerusalem Declaration, a doctrinal confession intended to form the basis of a new global fellowship of confessing Anglicans. There's no way to avoid new acronyms, right? So GFCA, Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans. The declaration upholds the Scriptures as containing all things necessary for salvation, the first 4 ecumenical councils and 3 creeds as expressing the Church's rule of faith, the 39 articles as authoritative for Anglicans today, the 1662 English Book of Common Prayer is referenced as a true and authoritative standard of worship and prayer, and the Anglican Ordinal is recognized as an authoritative standard. So we see emerging a movement of what many, including myself, believe to be God the Holy Spirit from within the Anglican Communion through the Global Anglican Future Conference, serving as a force for revival, for reform, for restoration of the Orthodox Christian faith within the Communion. Since that first Global Anglican Future Conference in 2008 then, there's been a back and forth tug-of-war going on between the forces of revisionism, manifest through the historical structures of the so-called Anglican instruments of unity, and those throughout the Communion who voluntarily participate in the Global Anglican Future Conferences through this movement now identified as the Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans. The second GAFCON met 5 years later, 2013 in Nairobi. That's the one I went to, and had 3 other of our Anglican chaplains helping Bishop Martin Minns kind of run the conference behind the scenes. This conference solidified a mandate to the GAFCON primates through the Nairobi communique and commitment to take forward the work of the GAFCON movement. Next. And the GAFCON primates just met this past April in Nairobi on the heels of the January primates gathering called by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So that one was January, and then the GAFCON primates in April, where the primary outcome of the meeting, now the primary outcome of the January meeting called by the Archbishop, which was never called a primate meeting, it was called a primate gathering, because there were issues with invitations and who was actually going to attend and so forth. But the primary outcome of the meeting was the somewhat surprising announcement of sanctions placed upon the Episcopal Church, which were almost immediately decried and denounced by the Episcopal Church, and then essentially ignored at the ACC meeting held in Lusaka then in April, just before the GAFCON primates meeting. And at that ACC meeting in Lusaka, Zambia, it was clear that the TEC representatives, delegates, had full voice and vote, so they just ignored the sanctions that had been applied. The GAFCON primates met immediately following this ACC meeting to, among other things, take note of the facts that had arisen out of this ACC meeting, to plan for the next conference to be held, you might want to make a note, in Jerusalem in 2018, and to accomplish a transition in primatial chairmanship from Archbishop Wabukala of Kenya to, next slide, to Archbishop Nicholas Oko of Nigeria. So he is the new chair for the Global Anglican Future Conference, Primates Council. In his first pastoral letter as the new chairman of the Global Fellowship of Confessing Anglicans, His Grace the Archbishop, Metropolitan and Primate of all Nigeria encapsulated the crux of the issue in response to the recent announcement by the Archbishop of Canterbury of a Lambeth Conference for 2020. And quoting this from an article by David Virtue. So this is Archbishop Oko. A number of provincial members of the Anglican Communion have created divisions with false teaching, resulting in millions of souls never hearing the good news of Jesus Christ, or conversely, hearing only a false gospel contrary to the Word of God, which is no gospel at all. Virtue continues, in his July pastoral letter to GAFCON members, who make up more than 70% of the communion, the Nigerian primate, whose province claims more than 20 million Anglicans, that's active Anglicans, said that what is tragic is not just the divisions within the communion, but that souls are at stake. Lives are at stake. Eternity is at stake. It reminds me, he says, of what the prophet Isaiah said to the people of his day. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. And Archbishop Oko goes on. This is the challenge of the Anglican Communion today. The message of the Bible is being turned upside down by those for whom my God means the God I want. Last month, the General Synod of the Scottish Episcopal Church voted for large majorities, to change its marriage canon to permit same-sex marriages. But Primus David Chillingworth said he had received assurances from the Archbishop of Canterbury that the Scottish Episcopal Church would still be invited to the proposed Lambeth Conference in 2020. Despite the hopes that we had for progress earlier this year, so he's referring to the January sanctions, it's clear that the proposed Lambeth Conference seems set to repeat the mistakes of 2008, unquote. Next slide. The next GAFCON gathering is scheduled for 2018 in Jerusalem, month and day to be determined, but Becky and I are saving our pennies. Next Sunday, together with Bishop Orgy and Bishop Dobbs and their wives, we'll have the honor of Archbishop Oko visiting right here at St. George's, together with his wife, who is known as Mama Nigeria, and his teenage daughter, Augusta. She's 14, I think, is that right? And a delegation of other archbishops and bishops. So there is your context for the upcoming visit, which will hopefully help you have a sense of kind of where we are, who God has called Archbishop Oko to be, and the tremendous leadership role that he's exercising in the church today, and what a profound honor it is for us to have Archbishop Oko and his delegation here with us at St. George's. Sir. Yeah, so it's in my mind, and Eric, feel free to jump in. It's a bit of a shift towards the idea that rather than our identity, our ethos as Anglicans and part of the Anglican communion is not invested black and white in being in communion with the Archbishop of Canterbury, but rather that we are the Anglican communion wherever the gospel of Jesus Christ is being preached according to that which has been passed on, the apostolic truth, which we clergy have been entrusted not to wield according to our own way of thinking, but to that teaching that has been handed on to us, of which we are to be faithful stewards. And so that, I think that's a bit of the shift.
Well, and the idea of a confession is sort of a it's firmly set confession of belief. You look at churches like the Presbyterian Church, they're a confessional church. They have the Westminster Confession, or the Lutherans have the Augsburg Confession. As Anglicans, we've actually always been a confessional church, but our confession has been the creed. And that's what sort of led to the schism, at least in the American church, was the creed is fairly basic. And we understand all Christians that adhere to the creed, whether they're Anglicans or Baptists or Presbyterians or Lutherans, all come under that umbrella of the worldwide Church Catholic. But the Episcopal Church cast off pretty much most of the historic creeds as well. And so that idea of being a confessional church, while we're not one in the historical understanding, we still have to understand that we do have a set code of belief within the Anglican Church, and whereas the Episcopal Church would say, no, you believe what you want, it's just all about us coming together and worshiping together. And it really does take more than just that.
And I think it still embraces what we talk about as the Anglican formularies, which you heard mentioned here. The Holy Scriptures together with the prayer book, 39 articles, the creeds, and so forth. Well, it's probably akin to what the difference between you all going to a Cana Synod meeting where delegates from all the churches in the convocation come to take counsel. So there's an agenda that has things like canon and constitutional changes and required things that everybody needs to hear, the clergy especially. It would be a difference between that and when Don and Eric and Bishop Orgy, go out for lunch and take counsel on theological issues and things going on. I mean, it's a little more, governing, so you'll never hear any sort of official changes or statements. You'll just sort of hear a report from primates meetings. Here's what we talked about and discussed. Although at the one in January, they tried to address, the elephant in the room and actually begin to deal appropriately with the dysfunction within the communion. Yeah, this was the Anglican communion primates. Not exactly. Well, of course, he called and chaired the primates gathering in January. So the primates of the church, most of them gathered. Some protested, didn't come. And miraculously, a lot of the primates, some of the primates who had in the past sort of towed the line or accepted maybe some donations that just kept their mouths shut, came back. They sort of repented and came back to the Orthodox position on human sexuality and marriage, and joined the other GAFCON primates in attendance in affirming that. And there was enough momentum then for there to be sanctions. They were extremely minimal, but it was something appropriate. And so that came out of that meeting, but then it was quickly in the press you would read statements that the Episcopal Church was angry and they're not going to abide by them. And then there was an ACC meeting called by the Archbishop in Lusaka in early April, early to mid, and it was that meeting where it's like the sanctions had never happened. So Tech didn't set the agenda. The Archbishop and the governing, so they were full participants. They were not supposed to. They were supposed to be sidelined. That they're supposed to have a 3-year period of being benched. Yeah. Okay. We better wrap it up there. Thank you.